Hi, so for my video diary about the Katrina and Ferguson articles and videos, I wanted to talk about the displacement of the Katrina victims, the government incompetence when it came to Hurricane Katrina and Ferguson, and I wanted to talk about just the effects of the shooting of Michael Brown and how it affected the community of Ferguson. So I guess to start, I'll talk about the displacement of Katrina victims. So I guess one thing I found really shocking from the video is that the people of New Orleans were torn from their homes and like the only life they knew, but a lot of them actually stayed and weathered the storm, knowing that the levees were going to fail and knowing that Katrina was a terrible hurricane that was coming because they couldn't afford to leave the life they knew. I guess when I think of like New Orleans and just living in the city, I don't really think of low income families and SES families, but like that was a very real situation that was going on for a lot of the people, so that they couldn't really leave their home. And also one thing that I found shocking was the stereotypes of the displaced victims who could actually leave. So I know in the video it said that the Katrina refugees were stereotyped as like the NOLA gang, and that they were violent and like irritable and stuff, which of like, I mean, of course they were like not themselves because they had to just leave their home and drop the only life they knew. But I also kind of thought that the stereotypes related with the displaced Katrina victims related to the Native Americans and how we talked about how they were displaced and kind of just moved, and how there were stereotypes about Native Americans as well among the American population. So just like that correlation of displaced individuals being stereotyped is different in a negative way, just because they're new and entering our environment, so we worry about them. So moving on to the government incompetence, I found it shocking that the government negligence for Katrina just showed that it just totally showed their opinion of the people and who to really save. So like in class we talked about like if Katrina were to hit Washington, D.C. or New York City, like they would have repaired the levees, they would have evacuated the city and rushed in more resources earlier. And here just the government was completely negligent to the people of New Orleans in the country of America that it serves. So that just totally shocked me, and really I was able to draw a lot of comparisons between the government negligence of minorities that we've been learning about in the Joel Spring books to the government negligence of the Katrina victims, just the similarities in how they treat people of minorities who aren't the majority of who they deal with, or how they treat people of low SES because that's not the important people to the government, which is just shocking because that's, I mean, a majority of the American population is going to be minorities, people of low SES, people are struggling. It's not the people that are high SES, prospering in the world, that is what the government highlights. They have to deal with all walks of life, and they have to suck it up and deal with all walks of life, in my opinion. And I guess the last thing that was shocking to me that I drew a correlation to was that the government didn't repair the levees, and they knew that they weren't going to hold when Katrina came. That's just terrible that they did that to a whole city, and it really drew the correlation to the pipeline that we talked about affecting, I can't think of the Native American tribe, but how they, in the same way that they knew that the levees were going to fail and destroy the city of New Orleans and the people that stayed but didn't do anything about it, it was the same as that they knew that the pipeline was going to affect and possibly pollute the water supply for a whole Native American tribe, but they didn't care enough to do anything about it. So just that correlation there. And then finally, I wanted to talk about Ferguson just by itself. So first of all, I guess I'll say that last semester I actually went and saw the documentary Whose Streets, which was about an inside view of the city of Ferguson, and I also read the book called The Hate U Give, which was like a first-person narrative of an African-American girl who was affected by her friend, who was an African-American high school-age boy who was shot and killed by a white policeman. So I kind of have some context about Ferguson outside of the articles we read, but I guess the one thing I want to talk about that stood out from the articles and also my past knowledge is that the city of Ferguson wasn't portrayed accurately by the media. What was going on throughout the day was just like normal civilized life. The documentary Whose Streets actually showed that like what started out as protests in Ferguson were actually peaceful protests, that then the Ferguson Police Department came in and started shooting tear gas at people who were peacefully protesting, made them disperse, and the violent protests that began to happen were actually like just some radical people who were protesting against the police force and not the majority of the protests that were going on. And I guess I also wanted to talk about the toxic relationship between the police and the Ferguson population. So I have here that the politician talked about the toxic relationship between the two and how that needs to be resolved. And that was also something that was touched on in the documentary Whose Streets, about how the people of Ferguson they cannot work well with the police department. The police department attacks the African American population of Ferguson and specifically goes after them and seeks them out for if they're breaking the law, and just like abuses that population and their rights as citizens. And so I drew that correlation there too. And finally, I wanted to talk about the loyalty of the entrepreneur, small business owner, who said that even though she has no income, lost her business, and like pretty much lost everything she owned, she still wanted to stay in Ferguson and give back to the community because that's where she was. And I just thought that was so great. And I kind of drew that to the minorities that we've been talking about, how like they are loyal to where they are from and the people that we're from, and the people that are where they're from, and how just this woman, even though she lost everything, unfairly lost everything, she still wanted to stay and give back to the community. And I just thought that was really great to see out of the darkness of all that was going on, that there was just that little spark of, this is still my community and I intend to give back to it in any way I can, even though I no longer have anything. And I guess you kind of saw that with the librarian too, that even though he was scared, he wanted to find a positive in all the negative that was going on. So I guess that's a summary of everything I got from the Katrina and Ferguson videos, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you.